As it is already known by many, Season 2 of The Walking Dead was altered many times during its development, not only from a gameplay perspective, but mainly for the story that it was supposed to tell and what each character's role was going to be. Therefore, I, in my humbleness, will try in this video to retell the story of Season 2, taking notice of previous evidence, statements, but also theories and personal touches of mine on what I think the story should or could have been. Before I start, I want to make a big shout out to In Cold Blood, who I believe is the person who mostly helped the fanbase to bring light to what Season 2 was originally supposed to be. The channel will be in the description, also as his mainly videos, so I recommend you check him out. It is actually funny because even after all these years and many things that have been said and revealed by developers or discovered by players, it is still a mystery what Season 2 was supposed to be originally. So let's dive in and figure out what it could have been. Maybe it will become a huge video and I may split it in 2 or 3 parts. Gosh, I hope there only goes to 3, but anyway, let's go. So, what happened to Lee's photo and Doug's drawing? Why would it be important to teach Sarah how to shoot? Why didn't they go to the city across the river and amid the ruins that it is also depicted in the slide for episode 5? Who the hell is George, person who was murdered by Alvin? And also, what the hell happened in the river shore near the cabin in episode 1? Those are a few examples of left out details that will be explored in this video. Episode 1, All That Remains, is actually funny since people kinda underrate this episode for its lack of plot momentum. But this is actually one of the best structured episodes in Season 2 alongside episode 2, A House Divided. So my point with this episode is that there are not that many things to alter from the final version we already see in game. Same thing will happen when I analyze episode 2. I'd say bigger changes will happen more when I go for episode 3 onwards. However, there are a few facts I'd like to point out from this episode in particular. So, the Lee photo and Doug's drawing, I'd keep them as reoccurring features for the story. As you can see in the video, Clementine puts them both on her pocket so we can have the option to burn them to light the fire. Then she falls to the river with them still on her pocket. No piece of paper would survive the rage of the river and would soak well in her pocket. A little change is that I'd still put the option to burn one or the other, but I then make Clem put what she didn't burn back inside the bag, so we could retrieve them back at the end of the episode when Clem finds it in the river shore. Speaking of shore, let's talk about it now. So, even though I wouldn't exactly change nothing with the scene we see in the end of this episode, I'm already telling you what I think happened here. After we get attacked by the 3 scavengers on the woods with Krista, we escape and Krista is nowhere left to be seen again. We hear her moaning and possibly being beat down and then the shot, but we can't tell if she's dead or alive. So my take is that not only she survived their attack, but was taken hostage and brought to the scavengers camp / base, where there were even more members of the scavenger group, including Roman from the 400 Days DLC. I actually like to think he could be leading them, especially when we already saw him fill in the role of leader in in Shell's backstory. At some point, Carver's crew, who were already around the place looking for the cabin group, would bump on them by the river shore, ruthlessly murdering every single one of them, with the exception of Ralph/Mike, who in this version of the story would be a unique character, and of course Victor, which we already see in the final game. Also, Krista's fate would still be a mystery here. The player would be left with no clue where she could have gone to. But don't worry, her whereabouts would still be revealed in good time. One more thing to add up. In previous versions of the story, there were plans for a bigger fishing scene with fish traps and all, and even the presence of Alvin and Luke, but I'd still cut it out, since I can't quite see it fitting with the plot line of the scavenger group massacre. So, moving on to episode 2. As I said earlier, episode 2, A House Divided, is also one of the best structured episodes in the season, and I'd change little in here as well. The thing I see as fitting would be to create a choice on giving Duck's drawing to Kenny in the scene they're catching up at the ski lodge. That's why we'd have to retrieve it in Clem's backpack in episode 1. Just for a moment, I ask that you just imagine Kenny's face, looking at the drawing she made for Duck, all the way back just after encountering Clementine, after these, 2 years since the season 1 group split up. I guess it would have been a really heartfelt moment, more than it already is in the final game, adding more to Kenny's character and his bond to Clementine, since the both of them didn't exactly had some sort of friendship in season 1. I mean, the only time Kenny actually talks to Clementine is for her to get on the train so she could shut up about Duck dying. So you get my point. If you burn the drawing, you could also give Lee's photo, and that would unchain a little conversation about memories from Lee and all the facts that happened in season 1. That sorta happens already in the game, but adding Lee's photo would also be a nice touch. Episode 3, In Harm's Way, originally called In Cold Blood, is one of the episodes people most enjoyed playing in this season since, differently from episode 1, the plot momentum here is all over. Even though the praise of many, it wouldn't be completely free of critics, and the fault people most like to point out about this episode is of course the poor integration of the 400 Days cast. Their appearance is limited to little cameos that last little more than 10 seconds at most. It's ironic because people really grew on the cast from 400 Days and were eager to see them being part of season 2's story, only to be ultimately disappointed. But let's analyze it for a second. The presence of the 5 main characters from 400 Days at Hal's would be determined by the choice you made playing the DLC, so you can argue they couldn't make them a big part of the story because they're all determinant characters. And that's where you actually mistake yourself. There's actually proof that they could have made every single one of them take a bigger role in season 2's story, and that's Bonnie. Out of all the main 5 characters from the DLC, she's the only one that has a bigger role, actually quite a big part to play, especially in episodes 2 and 3. You can then argue, well, they weren't supposed to do that because she was originally determinant like the rest of them. But being honest, I'm glad they did for her. And I am also not glad they didn't do it for the rest of them, since there's at least one of the characters I'd pick to be here to make the story better, at least in my opinion, and that would be Wyatt. I'll talk more about it later. So, as far as the changes go, I'll try to maintain most of the parts of the original episode, since I find the majority of it to be really good. However, I'd change the order some scenes would show up, also as adding a few more. So, to begin things with, the episode would fairly play out like it already does until the point of the first yard scene, where we meet Reggie, Jane, and Mike, and can walk freely at the place to interact with characters. Reggie would be more on Carver's side than he already is in the game, since he'd pull up the Georgie argument to back him up, saying that they were unjustified as soon as Alvin killed him when the cabin group escaped from there the first time. If you're a bit lost asking, who's George? Well, George is the name Carver uses at the cabin when Clem asks him who he was. When mentioned later at the kitchen discussion, Rebecca and Alvin are extremely uncomfortable with the name, suggesting a pre-existing relation with that name. Not only that, but Carver says this to Alvin at the ski lodge.
You remember George, Alvin? You see, I do. I remember a guy that was your friend named George. I remember when you murdered him in cold blood. And why? Because you didn't like me? You could have lodged a complaint. You could have been civil.
So Reggie would be a bit angry with them because of that. And remember, Alvin can potentially be at the scene, so that'd be an interesting detail there to add up to the scene. I'd add up a few more things to this scene. You see, as I said earlier, Mike would actually be Ralph, the same guy who attacked Krista in the woods, and then his group was slaughtered by Carver's group at the river shore, as I suggested. He then would have been one of the survivors who would have been brought to house to serve as labor for the expansion project that's so much mentioned in this episode. However, in this scene, we see Mike turning his head away from us, trying to get some sleep, so Clem wouldn't recognize him at first. Also, a thing people complain about this episode is Nick's presence, or should I say absence, because he went from a really present character to a background character because he's determinant in episode 2. Me personally, I have no complaints about how they implemented him in this episode for the most part. When in dialogue with our colleagues, he almost have something to say all the time, interacting to Luke, Kenny, and even Clementine. However, there are a few things I miss about him, and that's a more intricate conversation we could have with him. In the yard, the only thing we talk to him about is if we think Luke's coming or not. I mean, that is a big thing, but I'd also put the opportunity here to talk about Pete, Matthew, and Walter, showing that he holds remorse and guilt for these 3 deaths, even potentially saying a choice-based line. Speaking of Walter, remember on the episode 3 preview we see Kenny holding some sort of guilt over us for Walter being dead? Yeah, that would happen here as well, and if you choose to talk to Kenny, he'd talk about Walter to us, feeling guilty or not, depending on the choices we've made in the previous episode. I find these 2 conversations about Walter both Kenny's and Nick's, good ways to remember a bit of the character, who sadly never made it beyond episode 2, and in the final game is only mentioned once by Carlos, a guy that didn't exactly have anything to do with Walter. When interacting with Rebecca, I'd give the option of both asking about George, who was him and what happened to him, and ask her why people call Carver Bill. The detail of his nickname is something I've ever wondered, especially after Kenny asks about this in the truck and everyone is silent, feeling guilty. The episode, as you might have guessed, would have to be longer, as I would add an entire day of work, and this extra work day would be the perfect opportunity to develop more characters, including the 400 Days cast.
You better go.
So, I thought of a case scenario here where Tavia could be coordinating a work session inside house. I thought of the main corridor where we enter right in the beginning of the episode, where the food storage and all, but it could actually be anywhere else. This would be a placeholder scenario for many characters that potentially show up. The 400 Days cast, as I said, but also characters like Sarita, Jane, and even Nick. I'm giving more space to characters that don't quite appear that much in the episode, but really could be anyone else aside that. The following are a few dialogues and interactions that I thought here, with me, that would be cool to compose this scene. Becca and Clem working together on something fitting for girls their age to do. A moment with Sarita, maybe talking more about each other and bonding more. Carver quickly showing up and observing us doing the hard work. Nick and Bonnie talking about something, and well, this interaction would be determinant because of Nick. Furthermore, I thought of Wyatt and Shell talking to each other, both potentially mentioning Eddie and Roman respectively, and I thought here the possibility that Shell could have been part of the massacre at the shore, and even Tavia and Bonnie could tag along in this dialogue. The player would be given the choice to interact with them, and their responses would depend on how well you did your work. If successfully, Shell could mention that a survivor of the massacre was there in house, that being Mike, of course. After a long day of work, everyone would be tired and would go to bed. We'd still not have the opportunity to take a good look at Mike, and Rebecca would also potentially ask about Alvin, a lot worried about him. The second day of work would start at the armory exactly like we already see, but then Bonnie would tell Clem right after that to give nails to Mike and Kenny. This scene in the episode happens after Reggie is pulled off the roof, but here it would happen before that. When going to the expansion, this is the moment where Clem recognizes Mike as the scavenger from the woods who attacked her and Krista. We'd start asking questions to him, and with Kenny present at the scene, he'd back us up on the interrogation. Mike would affirm he knew nothing about Krista's whereabouts, and things would get tense. Kenny would even threaten Mike and fight with him, kinda like it already happens in the game. Interrupting them, walkers would break in and we'd be saved by Troy, exactly like it already happens, so we wouldn't get to resume asking Mike a few questions more. Clem would then find Luke in the comic store and plans for the radio exactly like in the game. In the follow-up to that, she'd be called only now to help Sarah and Reggie at the greenhouse. The greenhouse stuff would happen the same way it already does, with us choosing to help Sarah or not, and then Reggie getting pushed off the roof by Carver. Clementine would then be dismissed of service by Carver himself. We'd head back to the yard, and Bonnie would catch up to us. being here the opportunity to tell her about Reggie or not. At the yard, we'd find a few characters, maybe Sarita, Nick, and maybe others, and tell them Luke was outside waiting, and also what happened to Reggie. I'd put this option here to tell them about Luke, because I don't know about you guys, but I find it really dumb that Luke just happened to tell everyone off screen that he was there waiting for a radio. It takes away the whole purpose of the comic store scene for me, so I'd change it. Still in the yard, people would mention Rebecca was at Carver's office talking to him, and right after that, would be called to have the harsh talk to Carver. The conversation would basically go like it does already. However, he then mentioned what Clementine told him in the cabin. The thing he remembers from episode 2. I don't know if you remember, but when Carver's heading out the cabin, you would say something and there appears the Carver will remember this. But then he never mentions it again. So here, he'd say it to briefly tell the story about George. Who was he? And how he was killed by Alvin when they escaped, whose presence is also determined in the scene. Sort of a cool detail to be explored here. Carver would use it as leverage for us to join him on his civilizational crusade, as he already does. Sort of the thing when he says to us at the cabin, if they don't trust you, how can you trust them? Kinda wanted to throw us against them. The fireplace scene, where they plan to give Luke the radio, would fairly play out like it already does. However, at first, Mike and Jane would be excluded from the process. Not all of them trusted them both with their plans, so they wouldn't want them to join them at first. Jane would make her peace by saying the things with the walker guts to pass the herds, and Mike would also intervene, saying he wanted to be a part of the plan as well. A little discussion would happen, and Mike would say he was really sorry for what he did to Clementine and Krista on the woods, sounding actually sincere, and would be a choice to trust him or not. Regardless of the choice you've made, majority of the people would still vote him in, because they needed as much muscle as possible for the plan to work. After the discussion, Mike would lift us up and we'd get to the rooftop to enter the storage from above. And I'd put here Russell or Vince looking at the herd while talking to Tavia on the walkie-talkie. I think it would be way better to put one of them instead of this random dude here. We get to the storage while Tavia is here talking to Russell or Vince on the walkie, and then Vince or Russell appears and talks to her as he does already, about cigarettes and all that. A little detail I'd as well put here would be on the I thought about Doug today moment, where Kenny could potentially look at the drawing, in a way, complementing the choice we made in episode 2. Also, I'd put Sarita cuddling him a bit because she desperately needs more screen time. The little discussion on who should take the radio would happen more or less like it does. But then, when there's only Clementine, Kenny, and Mike, Kenny would be really suspicious of him, still thinking he isn't trustworthy enough to take the radio. And from this moment onwards, the episode would play out just like it does in the game. That being, Bonnie calls us, Troy finds us, Luke's discovered, Carver beats the crap out of Kenny, we set the PA system, Alvin potentially sacrifices himself, Kenny ruthlessly murders Carver and we make our way to the herd, Carlos dies, everything goes wrong and we choose to chop off Sarita's arm or not. And that's it for the video today, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you a lot if you made it to the end. As I said on the beginning of the video, the rest of the season will be covered on a follow-up post, which I think and hope it will be only one other video to cover episodes 4 and 5 at once. But I'm not sure yet. Anyway, I ask that you stay tuned on the channel and that you leave a like, comment, and consider subscribing for the channel for more Walking Dead videos like this one. Thank you all, and I'll see you in the next big one. See ya.
Dude, you better go up and see Bill. He doesn't like to wait. So, you should probably go.